Today we'll talk about an interesting subject. We'll give you some statistics that I found quite interesting, and that is the concept of the wrath of God. So I have Bible software that I use. So it makes it very easy for me to quickly search words or phrases and how often they occur, where they occur, and do they use different Greek or Hebrew words. They're translated the same in English, that kind of thing. So I can do all that research relatively quickly. So I did some statistics on some of the concepts and terms related to the wrath of God. So here is what I found. The phrase wrath of God occurs only in the New Testament. It never occurs in the Old Testament. And the phrase wrath of God occurs only 11 times in the entire Bible. Almost half of those, 5 of those, are in the book of Revelation. If we change it to the wrath of the Lord, that one actually occurs 14 times, and all of those are in the Old Testament. So the Old Testament is the wrath of the Lord, the New Testament is the wrath of God, but I assume they both mean the same thing. Then I looked for my wrath, God speaking, and God saying my wrath occurs 44 times in the Bible. 42 of those are in the Old Testament. The 2 in the New Testament are both in the book of Hebrews, quoting from the Old Testament. How about God's anger? The phrase God's anger only occurs one time in the entire Bible, and that's in Numbers 22:22. However, the phrase anger of the Lord occurs 36 times, all of those in the Old Testament. The phrase my anger occurs 31 times, all of those in the Old Testament. And then my fury occurs 7 times, all of those in the Old Testament. So we take all of these different terms for God's wrath or anger or fury. We discover that it occurs 144 times in the Bible. So the Bible has a lot to say about God's wrath, God's anger, His fury, all of that. So, I think in order to understand the wrath of God and what it is and what the Bible teaches about it, we need to understand another phrase that occurs in the Bible, and that is the phrase slow to anger. The phrase slow to anger occurs 14 times. One of those is in the New Testament, James 1:19. So in the Old Testament, 13 times we find the phrase slow to anger. 8 of those 13 are actually found in a formula. And this formula occurs all over the Old Testament. And here is that formula. The Lord is gracious, slow to anger. There it is. Abounding in steadfast love. So we find this phrase over and over and over again in the Old Testament, all across it. So understanding slow to anger, I think, helps us understand what we mean when we talk about the wrath of God and some of the implications that come from slow to anger and God's anger, God's wrath, God's fury. Literally, slow to anger is the idea of long of nose. The idea is that it takes God a long time to snort in anger. Okay? So God's wrath is His anger against sin and injustice. But God's wrath doesn't just pop immediately. It builds and it builds and it builds. I think this is the reason why we have almost half of the New Testament references to the wrath of God are in the book of Revelation. God takes a long time, but boy, when He's finally had enough, man, He has had enough. Like, that's it. He's like, I'm done, and His wrath just kind of, for lack of a better description, explodes. God releases it. So think of like a dam, and the water's building up behind it. And at some point, the water gets high enough that it breaks through the dam and comes rushing down. That's kind of the idea of the wrath of God. So that leads to 3 things we need to know about the wrath of God, or 3 implications, at least, of the wrath of God. The first one is God is slow to anger. He's slow to anger. He's very patient with us. He's very gracious to us. We keep sinning and we don't see the judgment fall immediately. And so it's very good for us. If God's wrath fell immediately, Adam and Eve would have been snuffed out as soon as they ate from the no-no tree, and that would have been the end of it. But God is patient and gracious, and He's very slow to anger. He takes a long time to snort, to release His anger. A second thing, implication of that is that God's anger, His wrath, when released, is massive. And it oftentimes comes quickly. Matter of fact, here's what we discover when you read the Bible. Numerous times God says, I did these things to punish you in order to correct you. So you and I have things happen to us that God does to brings into our lives to punish us, but it's for our own good. It's to help us to improve. It's to help us to abandon some of our sin. It's to help us to walk in righteousness and holiness. It's designed to help us grow in maturity, just like a parent disciplines their child to help them grow. It's for their own good. And so God does that. That's not the wrath of God. The Bible talks a lot about God's discipline. But at some point, the discipline is over, and now it's wrath. So it's like the student that gets in trouble a lot at school, and there are a lot of disciplinary, but at some point the school says, that's enough, we're kicking you out. We're expelling you. Like, it's come to an end. We've been gracious and patient. We've tried to help you. We've tried to discipline you. We've tried to help you improve, but there's been no improvement at all. You've just continued stiff-necked, stubborn, hard-headed, whatever words you want to use that you find in the Bible, to just resist all that we've done. And so now it's time just for punishment. And so when that punishment comes, it's usually swift and severe. God did all kinds of things to discipline Israel, and then finally had enough, and boom, the Babylonians swept in, and they find themselves in captivity in Babylon. They're like, how did this happen? Like, it was swift, and it was severe. And the same is going to be true at the end of time when God's wrath is poured out on all ungodliness. It's going to be swift, and it's going to be very, very severe. And we don't recognize its severity because we keep thinking, well, we've had this discipline, and that's like as bad as it gets. And we've rejected it, and things still seem to roll along pretty well. And that's the third thing, that we need to be very careful that we are not tempted, or we will be tempted, but that we resist the temptation to presume on God being slow to anger. That judgment will never come. I know there are a lot of people who think, God, the United States will stand forever. No one could defeat us. We're so technologically advanced. Our military is so far advanced over everyone else, blah, 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 blah. And yet we just seem to keep piling up sin and disobedience. I mean, we have killed by abortion tens of millions of babies over the last several decades. I mean, millions and millions and millions and millions of babies slaughtered in the name of convenience. We have endorsed and pushed and celebrated every form of sexual perversion, gender identity. We have redefined marriage. We have devalued marriage. More people live together rather than get married. We have made divorce easy. It just, we have almost come to the point where we expect businesses to be corrupt. We have government that is corrupt, that overtaxes, overspends, overindulges in debt. The list just goes on and on and on of just how we have compounded and piled up sin after sin after sin after sin after sin. And yet the United States still stays. We're economically prosperous. We celebrate freedom. We have all these things. And I love being an American. I love my country. I believe that we should be patriotic. And God has blessed us immensely. And the modern missions movement has been funded primarily by the United States. I mean, we have Christians in the United States have spent billions in sending the gospel around the globe and ministering to people around the world. But the reality is the idea that somehow, well, doesn't seem like God has judged us. Boom, it comes swiftly and it comes unexpectedly. Jesus said that his return is going to be, people's going to be living their life, and then suddenly here he is and the judgment. So the idea of God's wrath and God's anger, yes, it is violent when it comes, but it doesn't happen immediately. God is patient. He is slow to anger. And we need to be aware that that does not make us think that judgment's not, it is going to come. We will face the judgment. And then the last thing I want to say about the wrath of God is it is possible to escape it. It is possible to avoid that final judgment. And that is by putting our faith in Jesus Christ, who on the cross took in himself the wrath and the anger of God against my sin. It was poured out on Jesus in my place. So the wrath of God is satisfied, and is satisfied in the death of Jesus. Therefore, I'm the one that does not have to bear the brunt. The crucifixion means nothing if there's no wrath of God. There's no reason for Jesus to die if there's no punishment and no judgment for our sin. But the wrath of the Lord, the wrath of God, the anger of God, my anger, all those terms we saw, a warning to us that God is slow to anger is both a promise and a warning that even though he's slow to anger, he's not without anger, that someday his wrath against sin is going to be revealed in its fullness. But you and I, through Jesus, don't have to suffer that. So I encourage you, I implore you, don't take God's patience and his slowness to anger for granted or for that being permissive of our sin. And secondly, rejoice that because of Jesus Christ and his death on the cross, the wrath of God is satisfied for those of us that place our faith in him. So God bless you. Be thankful that God is slow to anger. Be thankful that you will miss the wrath of God if you belong to Jesus. But don't take for granted that wrath doesn't come and that we have a permissive God. We do not. So God bless you. Have a great day.